the research panel session. This will start with a talk from Adam Smith from BU on responsible AI. And then we'll have several panel members who will be up here, and they will give a brief introduction, and then we'll take questions from the audience and have a discussion. So without further ado, I think we have the
my clicker, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you guys are familiar with Indico, but the slides are all posted and you can download the slides. If you're like me and you fall asleep in the middle of talks and then you want to remember what's going on, you can always download the slides.
You're not allowed to fall asleep in my talk.
All right, go ahead. Thank you.
Someone hit play for me. Yeah. Okay. Right. So, hi, my name is Adam Smith. I'm a faculty member at BU in Boston University in computer science and a couple of other departments. And this is a session on responsible computing. So my research, I'm interested in a number of different problems in computer science. One of them is a bunch of work related to data privacy. So that's going to be the focus of the talk. But I kind of wanted to start by raising the question of what we mean by responsible computing, since it's the topic of the panel and it means a lot of different things. And I was trying to think about like how to nail it down a little bit. And I think it's probably best defined via its failure or via failures. You know, I don't think any of us aim to do irresponsible computing, but we nevertheless manage. You know, here, like one great example is, you know, kind of thing that I have in mind is the gender shades work from a number of years ago, where researchers noticed that these computer vision models for identifying faces in images worked extremely poorly on people with dark skin, because, you know, basically because of the data they were trained on and the people who ran the experiment. Very different flavor of failure is, you know, memorization of individual data points by complex models. So we train these enormous machine learning models with, you know, millions to billions of parameters. They encode all sorts of crazy information that is very hard to figure out. And there's like a number of nice papers in the last few years that point out that if you poke and prod these models, they will just spit out large chunks of their training data verbatim. You know, another thing, reproducibility is another example of a sort of a failure of what we probably most of us think of as sort of responsible computing, in this case, data analysis, where you get, there are lots of different things that are going on with replicability and reproducibility, as was highlighted in the previous talk. I really like this paper from a number of years ago, I guess at this point, 2014, by Gelman and Loken, that sort of formulates one of the issues that goes on, which they call the garden of forking paths. The fact that you have all these choices that you make about how to analyze the data based on the data you have, and those choices themselves may not show up in your final paper, in the final way you present the results, but there's all this kind of implicit, well, p-hacking is the other term that people used a lot, that that may lead us astray in the conclusions we draw. And then to pick another example, this is the image is just Magritte, but the example has to do with the right to be forgotten. So the you know, over the last few years, one of the kind of data rights type things that people have tried to formulate is the ability for individuals to control how their data is used. And maybe the kind of prime example for this is GDPR's right to be forgotten. This came up the phrase arose from a case of a Spanish man suing Google to have his name removed from certain specific types of search results. Okay. So, you know, what do these things have in common? I mean, these are each of them. I mean, I chose these to be all very different. There's the common thread here is sort of you know, broadly speaking, a failure to engineer for the entire use case, right? And so if we talk about what responsible computing might mean, you know, it is in some sense losing sight of the forest for the trees. But we don't design trees in quite the way we design software. And so maybe urban planning is like a better analogy. It's sort of losing sight of the city for the building, right? That really what we need to be doing is thinking, very broadly as these sort of systems we're designing are evolving and out there in the world, understanding how they're operating in context, how they're affecting people, formulate, and that gives us research goals also. We need to be able to formulate intermediate goals for the pieces of these systems that actually align with their final use, and then develop technical tools to help us achieve these goals. Okay. And this is sort of an ongoing effort. We do this as long as the system is evolving, which is basically forever, right? So, so with that sort of framing in mind, the kind of thing I've spent a lot of time on is data privacy. And so what I mean by that, I'll try and narrow it down for the purpose of the talk to privacy in statistical data sets. So what do I mean? Imagine let's imagine as an example, the problem faced by the US Census Bureau. So they collect tons of information about lots of people. So they do the decennial census that all of you, if you live in the US, which probably all do, should have answered. But they also do all sorts of much more detailed surveys like the American Community Survey, which is like all about, well, pretty much everything in your life, plus other surveys. And their goal is to make this data as widely available as possible while providing some kind of strong protection for people's privacy, both for reasons of, both for ethical reasons and legal reasons, and also just basic trust reasons, because they want people to actually answer their questions. And so they've got this problem, this sort of tension between, I don't have a pointer, I think, on this thing. This tension between accuracy and trying to get as much of the information as high quality as possible out there, and sort of protecting information about individuals. And this sort of abstracting this a bit, it comes up in all sorts of places, right? Census data, but also public health data. Social networks like Facebook is trying to make information about the way misinformation spreads on Facebook available for use by researchers, but that's very thorny for all sorts of reasons, one of them being privacy. Educational data is another. Anyway, so I've been involved in a push over the last 10, 15 years to try and take this area and put it on much more rigorous foundations. So trying to understand exactly what we mean by this question of privacy or confidentiality, and how can we build systems that give us some guarantee that they're providing that. And so that's what I want to talk about for the remaining 10, 15 minutes. There we go. So really two things I'll talk about over. One is sort of why this problem of data privacy, statistical data privacy, is challenging. I'll illustrate that with a particular work of mine, recent work of mine on memorization and machine learning, although I'll try and frame it a little more broadly than just the one paper. And then I'll also talk about things we can do, and I'll talk about this one concept called differential privacy, whose development I was involved in, and that has been reasonably influential, and that raises some interesting research questions. All right, so let's say we've got some data and we want to put it out there, right? So our first attempt might be to remove the obviously identifying information, names, exact addresses, social security numbers, everything else, and just get it out there. And that approach, first of all, has a number of problems. First of all, the details might be the stuff you're interested in, right? Like you might want to know exactly where people live because you're, studying, very fine-grained level geographic information. But also, really, the real problem is that it doesn't work, right? So, for example, here's a photograph. I've grayed out the face of the subject of the photograph, but pretty much everybody in this room identified the subject immediately, not because you recognized his face, but because there's all these other cues that are not, obvious identifiers, but that, you and I can immediately connect to other sources of information we have, like how many people with dark skin have stood behind a lectern like that. And And so that allows us to figure out who it is very quickly. And basically, this problem is that kind of connection with the outside world. Like computers do that way better than we do. And like basically, like every data set looks like this, right? In one way or another. So even blurred faces are a great example. So, someone showed that if you train a facial recognition algorithm on blurred faces, they actually do pretty well. There was a nice study a number of years ago about someone, re-identifying, guessing people's men's last names, specifically men's last names, given only their DNA. Which seems a little weird until you sort of think about it a little bit. You realize like Y chromosomes and last names, they travel on more or less the same path. There are, of course, exceptions, but by and large. There's a nice, fun example of someone re-identifying like celebrities in a taxi cab data set. These are just like a random selection of examples. The point is that in some sense, it's very hard to separate identifying information from non-identifying information. Pretty much everything useful is an identifier. Now, these examples that I had on this previous slide, you might say, well, the problem's granularity, right? Like you're trying to release these sort of like, DNA or stuff like that. That's very fine-grained information. It's very detailed. What if what I'm doing is like training, releasing aggregate statistics like sums, or I'm training a model? Maybe I'm fine, right? But it turns out that nailing down what we mean by aggregate is also hard, because all these sort of rich types of information we release, even though each one might be hard to use, taken together, they can encode data in really surprising ways. A trivial example might be if I release the average salary of the people in this room immediately before and after I walk out of the room, right? So you can count, how many people are in the room. You can figure out the sum of the salaries before and after I'm in the room. Very quickly, you can figure out, what I am, right? So that's a really simple example, but it turns out that there's now this body of research showing that this and other types of problems come up when we're releasing very rich information. It's very hard to release lots of very accurate statistics about a data set without releasing individual level information. Okay, there are these things called reconstruction attacks that are kind of more along the lines of what I was just saying, of the salary example, things called membership inference attacks, which might allow me to test, for example, if a particular person whom I know something about was part of a clinical study, for example. That was like the original example of Niels Homer and other biologists back in 2008. And memorization in machine learning is another type of example, and I'll talk about it momentarily, talk a little more about it. But the upshot of these bodies of research is that basically if we want to make data available, there's just no way to release everything everyone would want to know about a reasonably rich data set without basically releasing the data. And so we're faced with a trade-off, and we need tools to help us navigate that trade-off and understand, what are the points on the kind of Pareto frontier, what's possible. And these are thorny questions. They're, the census, some of you may know this, has been going through changes in how it releases data from the decennial survey and the other big one, the ACS, and they've been running into lots of pushback for various reasons, some valid, some not, but definitely the complexity of the question definitely came to the fore. All right, so let me just talk a little bit about memorization. So let's imagine we're training a machine learning model on a big data set that we like. This is something many of us like to do. Sometimes memorizing data points is like an explicit part of the training process. Like, for example, if I'm releasing a nearest neighbor classifier, nearest neighbor classifier assigns a label to a new point based on the label of the nearest point in the training data set. There, the classifier is basically the data set. Like in terms of information content, it's pretty much the same thing. Okay, so no surprises there that the classifier would tell you a lot about the data. Or if you've heard of support vector machines, so this is a particular algorithm for training a linear classifier, it's normally described and basically explicitly described in terms of specific data points. Oh, okay, fine. Okay, but sometimes memorization happens in unexpected ways as like a side effect of training that surprises people. And this study I mentioned earlier that looked at GPT-2s. GPT-2 is big tech language, natural language model. Probably all of you have heard of it. You sort of poke it by asking it to complete phrases that could be parts of its training data. And very often it will complete it. You find phrases that are relatively unique in the training data, and it'll complete those, more or less verbatim. This paper I thought was fascinating. I mean, this is not the only one. There are a bunch of other papers that do similar things. But it got me thinking about whether or not memorization is somehow inherent to memorization of individual examples is somehow inherent for good machine learning, that it's necessary when you're learning complex things. Okay. And one of the, I think just looking at the average age in the room, probably many of you have raised children. You watch your kids, they learn the way they learn things, right? They learn entire phrases as single words sometimes, right? They don't even, I'm struggling. Sorry, I had some examples that I'm now blanking on, but they memorize phrases entirely, like just perfectly, every phoneme, and then later they figure out like what all the parts mean, right? And so, one might wonder if this is sort of fundamental to learning, and I think the kind of emergent consensus is that, unfortunately, sometimes it is. At least if we want to use our data as much as possible. So, just to be clear, what I mean is not what I'm talking about is not what is often called interpolation. So, interpolation is a phenomenon where my machine learning model fits my training data perfectly. This is many of you may know, this is something comes up a lot when you're training deep, highly parameterized models, where what you end up learning is something that looks more like the red curve than like the green curve, and that violates classical theory from statistics and machine learning. But you know what? It works, and it works really well, and there are various good reasons for that. But what we're after is something different. We want to understand not if it's necessary to store the labels in some sense of the data, but actually the full data examples themselves. And that's sort of roughly what we show. We show that there's sort of a natural learning problem. So you're given data from some distribution that's labeled, so it's a supervised learning problem. It's a supervised learning problem. You produce a classifier, and your measure of error is how well it predicts the labels of future examples. It's just a classic supervised learning setting. And basically what we show is that there are natural learning problems. They have a kind of a clustering flavor for which every data set, at least with high probability, has some subset of vulnerable rows, vulnerable examples. Such that this subset of vulnerable examples is big. So it's, let's say, at least 10% of the data set. And every learning algorithm with reasonably low error, meaning essentially memorizes most of the contents of those rows, and we have some mathematical formulation of what that means that maybe doesn't matter so much for this talk. But the point is that there's this huge subset of the examples which end up being encoded, possibly opaquely, in the machine learning model and have to be in order for it to perform well. Okay. And I don't have time to give the nuances of this, but basically what it's showing is if we're trying to extract everything we can for a learning problem for a given amount of data, which is generally what people try to do, then this type of memorization, they're kind of reasonably not crazy settings where it's like entirely necessary. I mean, it's not about deep networks. It's not about a specific optimization method or anything like that. It's fundamental to the task. There's some interesting implications of this result that I'm just going to skip this slide. Sorry, because I'm running slowly. There's some interesting implications of this result for why we use these huge many parameter models for learning these days. But you can ask me afterwards. All right, so let me just give some positive news. So another, in addition to trying to break things, which is one of the things computer scientists love to do, we'd like to get, have some tools to help us make more positive statements, to say, well, here's a way to reason about a system that allows us to argue that it's not leaking too much individual information. Okay? And one notion that emerged from, as I said, from my work is this concept of differential privacy. And so it is, there are a bunch of systems deployed that sort of use this. So differential, maybe I should back up a second. Differential privacy is sort of a solution concept. It's not a specific algorithm. It's a definitional framework. A number of systems deployed in industry use this kind of framework for reasoning about leakage. The Census Bureau is moving towards doing this in many of its systems. And there's this sort of burgeoning field of research going on and trying to understand not only how to design differentially private algorithms and systems, but also how this concept connects to other fields in computer science. But I'll just briefly tell you what the notion is, and pretty much wrap up with that. So the idea of differential privacy is to perform a thought experiment and say, I've got some algorithm that I want to reason about. I'm going to imagine running it on a data set. And I'll imagine also running it on some other data set in which exactly one person's data has been changed. Okay, so I'll change one person's data, or maybe add or remove a person. And the question I want to ask is this: this algorithm might be randomized. It might add noise to the computation or do some sampling or stuff like that. And so there's some distribution for any given data set. There's some distribution on outputs it might produce. And the requirement we'll ask is that the distribution not shift by very much when we change one person's data. Okay, so basically what that's saying is like for any particular subset of the outcomes, the probability of that set won't change much when you replace my data with total junk. So in particular, like that subset might be, those might be the outcomes that cause my my health insurance premiums to go up. And so what's saying is, maybe my health insurance premiums will go up because maybe you will learn that smoking causes cancer and that I'm a smoker. And if I'm a smoker, you will raise my health insurance premium. But that won't be because my data were in the data set. It will be because you learned this fact about human biology. And so this is the basic concept. And it turns out it's a relatively simple but powerful sort of framework for looking at a lot of data analysis and trying to think about what is coming through about individuals. And so there's like lots of research on this right now, on modifications and variations on the definition, designing algorithms, breaking stuff, trying to push the limits by developing things that like attack and extract information, and some interesting connections to other areas that I'll skip over. So what I'll end with, I was going to talk a little bit about deep learning, but I was overly optimistic about my time. Sorry. Maybe I'll end with what we're missing, and I really promise this is my last slide. So on one hand, I think there were sort of coming back to the forest missing the forest for the trees. What scientists are good at is sort of pulling out parts of a problem that they could solve and trying to solve them. And I think we're sort of moving towards that in this space of responsible computing very broadly, and data privacy in particular. But we always have to be going back and asking, whether or not we're sort of, planning the city right. And so like one kind of thing that we don't have are good principles, say, for what personal ownership of my data should mean. What kinds of rights should people have for how their data is used, and how might those be, what would it even mean to control how my data are used? A lot of the technologies, speaking of sort of losing the forest for the trees, again, a lot of these privacy technologies people are developing are really cool and really powerful, but they're sophisticated enough that they can often only be deployed by very sophisticated organizations like big tech. And so then it's a question, well, are you just concentrating power? Or are you actually like democratizing, to use the word from the previous talk? And then there's this sort of like ongoing pain point of trying to communicate between the technical research community and people who think more at the policy level, either implementing policies or research on them. And I don't want to read their court opinions, and they don't want to read my papers, and that's a problem, right? And so, and of course, the problem is my papers are very well written, but their court opinions are just okay. So, how do we move beyond that? It's an ongoing process. I think there's a lot of research going on right now that really does seek to bridge these gaps. But it's something that I'd love to see more of. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks. So we'll take a few short questions now, and then we'll start with the panel. We can have a long discussion. Yeah.
I mean,
Or should we just go straight to the panel?
I mean, I don't know. You tell me.
I mean, I want to ask my question.
Okay. Sure. I'm happy to take.
All right. I'm going to ask my.
questions.
It's also a good panel discussion, but all right. I'll ask my question because I can't stop thinking about it. So in my field in physics, we have a lot of very good simulation and a lot of very good data. And we're coming to the conclusion that we want to do kind of data augmentations with the simulation, so merging simulation and data, and making kind of larger data sets that cover the kind of bias, implicit bias in many of our data sets. And I know there are other fields starting to go this direction, but I'm wondering how much work can be done to kind of make like synthetic data sets to really avoid some of these kind of implicit problems.
Right. I think it's hard. I mean, so there are in many settings, sort of the thing you'd really want is provably not attainable. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try and sort of see what we can pull off. But basically, anytime you're producing synthetic data, you have to be kind of ideally very transparent about what this synthetic data is, say, preserving from the original data and what it's not. And that's often very hard to divine from the procedure. And on one hand, often this generation of synthetic data really can help with lots of stuff, but at some point you're still like, there's no free lunch, right? And you can't produce something from nothing. If you've got 30 data points about your minority population and 1 million data points about about rich college kids, then there's like only so much you can do. There's you can generate all the synthetic data you want, but the point is you don't know enough about the people you're trying to study, right? And so I think being humble about what you might hope to achieve and what you're actually getting is really important there.
All right, let's take one more question. I don't want to take over the questions. Valerie?
So disastrous because they built it, they trained it, if I understand correctly, they trained it on data that was essentially from resumes from people at Amazon. And so when they tried to use the tool, it threw out resumes from anybody who had gone to a women's college or had been captain of the women's softball team, et cetera, et cetera. So my question about synthetic data is, if we're trying to be responsible, if we want to build tools that will effectively reflect the reality we'd like to have, then following up on your example, if you have 1 million data points from rich white kids and a small set of data points from minority kids, why use the 1 million plus the small amount? Why not balance your data set? So my question always has been, why didn't Amazon just take 50% of the training data and arbitrarily put in women's names, women's colleges, women's sports activities, and see what they got? Because then it's synthetic data, but it's synthetic data that reflects the world you'd like to have. And would it be irresponsible to do that?
Right. I don't think it's irresponsible at all, but I think it's hard to do well. And like so first of all, there's lots of both, technical and non-technical work on this broad topic, and it has been over the last few years. If you're interested in this kind of thing, there's a conference that, Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency is the name of the conference that basically specializes in this. And then there's lots of work at, well, pretty much in any other field of data science, you'll see papers on these topics. So there's a lot going on. But the short answer is, if you know exactly what aspects of the data you should mess with to solve the problem, that's excellent, and you should do that. I think the issue is generally that it's hard to figure that out. And, maybe you can fix one specific aspect, but then what about, to pick on the example, sure, I can put in the names of all these elite women's colleges, insert a bunch of Wellesley grads in there, great. So that's fine, that takes care, maybe it helps with one dimension. But what about all the other dimensions in which we're missing people? And like, these sort of manual interventions are going to be limited to the things I can explicitly think of. And the whole promise of, deep learning is to kind of automatically construct representations that capture the useful aspects of a problem. So I think the real answer is just that it's hard to do well. And, when you've got all these intersecting concerns of, gender and race and economic class, and then all the stuff we don't even think of formulating, it's like a non-trivial task to pull off. Not to give Amazon a pass, but I think, like, because they screwed up for sure. But I think doing that, fixing that data set would, is by no means a trivial endeavor. Yeah.
All right, let's do one more question. Then the panel members, you should all come up now, and we'll start right away with the panel.
I don't have a question, but just a comment to follow up on yours. And I think with deep learning models, it's even harder because we don't know what they're learning, right? So they're like nature. They're there, and we don't know how they're going to behave until we try it. So it's more complicated than just knowing what to fiddle with.
Right. Yeah. Part of. I mean, even not to pick on even without deep learning, though, I guess maybe the point you made nicely on your slide is that I've got this huge system with all these points along the way in the pipeline, and wrapping our heads around that thing is like essentially impossible for humans. And so we need to find ways to narrow the problem and solve it in a more local way, but in a way that those solutions actually help in the big picture, and that's a hard thing to do.
All right, let's thank the speaker again. So, Adam, why don't you stay up there, and then we'll start with the panel members. I guess, Tanya, since you're here, do you want to? Yeah, we can load your slides, and you can give a quick overview, and then you're welcome to sit or stand as you please.
Or dance or whatever.
Yeah. Oh, no.
I don't know. We're gonna do this, right? Oof, right. Should I impersonate Hamad or?
Yeah, our third panel member is online. So,
Oh, okay. So maybe he should start then.
why don't you start?
Okay, then I need my slides somewhere. Anyway, if you haven't figured that out yet, I'm Tanya Berger-Wolf. I am from the Ohio State University, representing the Imageomics Institute here. There we go. Yes, with two of my colleagues, all three of us here, many behind us. So we were given for this panel a couple of prompts in terms of what we would talk about, which aspects of research that harnesses data revolution. I think as it's emerging and as the conversations are progressing, there are a couple of very kind of fun, and the questions that we were given, a lot of pain around data sharing, data reproducibility, data interoperability, data infrastructure, which includes not only the kind of cyber infrastructure, that's the easy part, throw money at it, you can get you can find a place to put your physical bits, but how do you make data work with different, what about metadata? What about, not well-aligned data? What about, sparse data? What about, what about private data? What about privacy, conscious data or biased data? So like we keep on talking about these things. So, and how do you make sense of it? So as you may have seen in my lightning talk, and I pointed out that the Imageomics Institute, as in learning biological traits, actually semantically meaningful information from images directly, is all about very sparse, messy, misaligned data, which comes from the massive collections of images in biology that are digitized biological collections of Natural History Museum, natural observations, iNaturalist, photographs on Instagram, but also camera trap images, or the photographed insects from collections, or the research project. So the data are very, very messy. We're all about it. And then you combine it with textual data from field guides, for example, or from the descriptions of species, or taxonomic keys, which is very well organized kind of structures, but that point out to certain parts of the image, or ontologies of biological traits. And so we're trying to use these structures with this very messy data to get to the point of getting meaningful information from images, which I think kind of a theme in many other research institutes and even the foundation investigating this kind of data. So there are a couple of, of all the prompts and all the questions, I just want to kind of point out a couple that are very, very relevant for us. This is the how to impose scientific rules, inductive bias within your algorithms. And so we're founding our whole approach on knowledge-guided machine learning, which is also known under inductive rules, inductive bias, or physics-guided machine learning, domain-guided machine learning, and so on and so forth. I'll give you just a couple of examples in a second. But the other thing I want to point is dealing with open sets that are messy but convey key concepts. How do you best deal with handling real world data? This is a whole other conversation. I just want to make two things. That a lot of it is not about even mechanisms of data. It's about negotiations, conversations, being very, very inclusive with people who are giving that real world data before you can even use it. And and doing it by design, and using technology, using AI, using machine learning to include those data and those stakeholders by design. We had a whole policy brief, essentially a quadrennial paper from CCC, published in CCC on citizen science, or AI, and computational research that addresses some of these aspects. But back to knowledge-guided machine learning, if we can go to next slide, just to kind of give examples why it matters and what it can give you. So as I mentioned, we're all about extracting biologically meaningful data from images, such as traits. So we can all do species classification now, probably reasonably well, from pretty much any collection of sufficiently large collection of images, quite often actually off the shelf for some collections of images, without pre-training. But if you look at species where, this is minnows, about 200 species of fish that are actually pretty subtle distinction between them. So you can throw machine learning with species classification, and you're going to get some accuracy reasonably, but not perfect. For the collections that are sufficiently large, for where you have very few images, and that's the standard in biology, you have very, very skewed distributions of data per class over and over and over again. So some classes have like 2-3 images, maybe. That's it, right? Species. So what happens then? Or some museums have very few images. And so there you don't do very well. But if you add just the simple structure of phylogeny, right, to like 2 levels of phylogeny, of guiding and doing hierarchical classification, not only you improve accuracy, can you click,
Next
click
slide.
on the slide. Where can I click somewhere? Oh, clicker is there. Okay, sorry. Okay, great. Not only you improve accuracy, but when you start looking at saliency maps of where do the networks, like what do they pay attention to in the image, somewhere it's not. Okay, in the image, it actually starts concentrating around areas of the image that are a lot more biologically meaningful. So imposing structure is actually useful. That's a very, very, very simple example of how you impose structure. The other thing I want to make the point is that it actually matters. Humans have very, very limited visual hardware to see a lot of the biology, and it's true not only for biology. We perceive the world with very limited visual hardware. For example, we do not distinguish, we don't have good red, orange color acuity to see the differences between some phenotypes of polymorphic moth. Machine learning has no problem doing this because the whole thing evolved not for human benefit, but for the bird eye benefit, right? And so we're also very biased in terms of what we consider biological traits. This is where actually machine learning and data-driven approaches have a huge advantage of letting us see what we normally do not see if we do it carefully. And that's where not only the argument for using machine learning, but also for really leveraging the structure, the scientific structures, the biological structures that get us away from the human bias and let us point out. And this is what we're doing for trying to understand the mimicry in butterflies, because all of the guys, for example, these are, you can see the pairs, right? But each pair on the left comes from from one species, and on the right from another species of butterflies that are not related to each other as strongly as they are to every other butterfly in the same column. And so to understand this, how this evolves, we cannot use human eye mechanisms. We can not use human biases. We need to use the fundamental biology and the structures that the genotype, the taxonomy, the phylogeny, the biogeography, the ecology, and the adaptation give us to impose that on the machine learning to extract anything meaningful from data. In this case, I'll pause.
Okay, thank you. All right, let's go to our next speaker, Hamed. Can you share your screen actually? That's probably the easiest.
Yeah, great. All right, let me just share now. Right. So do you see my screen?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for listening to this talk and watching this talk. So I'm Hamid Hassani from UPenn, and I'm representing EnCORE, which is one of the recent phase 2 tripod institutes. So I'm gonna talk very briefly about the interplay between overparameterization and robustness. Why is overparameterization important? It's because our modern deep learning systems are typically highly overparameterized in the sense that the number of parameters that we have at training time for our neural networks is typically much larger than the number of training points, data points. So this is essentially a definition of overparameterization, much more parameters than the number of data points. And now, regarding robustness, we also know that these deep neural networks are highly fragile with respect to different types of distribution shifts and adversarial examples. So the main question to be answered here is whether or not overparameterization is the right regime for robustness. And why is robustness relevant to this panel? Well, it's because robustness is one of the main constraints in designing safety critical applications. And by safety critical application, I mean any application where the detections, decisions, and recommendations made by learning-based systems would directly impact the well-being of humans. For example, we can think about self-driving cars, robotics, medical imaging as different kind of domains. What's important here is that machine learning systems, when deployed in safety critical applications, must be robust and trustworthy. And trustworthy AI is one of the main pillars of responsible AI. Now, when talking about robustness, one of the natural starting points would be the phenomenon of adversarial examples, which can be simply explained as follows. So we know from the success of deep learning that if you train a deep learning model for a standard supervised learning task, for example, a standard labeled data set, then on newly unseen test images, your model that you have trained would essentially work quite well in predicting the label of the image. Now, what you could do is to, in order to explain the adversarial examples, what you could do is to add a very small amount of noise to the same image, such that the perturbed image would be indistinguishable to us as humans compared to the original image. But also the choice of this noise can be made in a way that the perturbed image would be misclassified by the model that we are using. So what's important here to note is that you can add a very small amount of noise and you can fool the model to misclassify. Of course, the choice of the noise here is adversarial, but what's important is that these kind of deep neural networks are kind of fragile with respect to kind of these perturbations here. Now, speaking more mathematically or geometrically, typically we treat data points as some points in some Euclidean space. And in order to find adversarial examples, we draw balls, let's say Euclidean balls of radius epsilon. Think of epsilon to be a very small number around each data point. And within this ball, we look for points, perturbations that can cause misclassification. And these kind of perturbations are called adversarial examples. Again, the main point here is that our deep learning systems are highly fragile with respect to this kind of norm-bounded perturbations. Now, in machine learning, the usual training paradigm when there is no adversary is the empirical risk minimization framework, where essentially you find a model that fits best to the training data, as you see here, this theta hat, the solution of ERM. And as I mentioned before, the solution of ERM, at least for deep networks, works very well on unperturbed or data points that come from the actual distribution of the data. However, it fails badly on adversarial examples. In order to fix this failure issue, this robustness issue, people solve a different objective to improve robustness. And that objective is called the robust ERM objective, which is essentially the ERM objective. However, you also at training time, you perturb your data points in order to account for adversarial examples at training time. Now, as I said, our modern neural networks are highly overparameterized, and the benefits of overparameterization have been provably established in recent years. For example, in two-layer neural networks, there is this very nice result of May and Montanari that essentially proves this double descent phenomenon for these two-layer neural networks. Essentially, what you see here is that if you look at the test error, the standard risk, as they call it, it's minimized when the model, your neural network, is infinitely overparameterized. Okay, so overparameterization here is beneficial. As you have more and more overparameterization, your network becomes, your error becomes better and better. So question that we've been thinking about within the context of EnCORE, our institute, is what curve do we get if you consider robustness or adversarial robustness into account? And I'm going to just explain one result that we've recently had. Again, this is for two-layer neural networks, very standard setting, L2 adversarial perturbations and so on. And you train these networks adversarially using these robust ERM kind of objectives. And again, as I mentioned before, for these two-layer neural networks, we know that when there is no adversary, overparameterization is very beneficial. Now, if you add adversarial perturbations, you can show that for these kind of two-layer neural networks, the best error, the best robust error happens when the network is highly underparameterized. In other words, overparameterization for robustness is actually hurting robustness for these kind of two-layer neural networks. So essentially, what this result says is that is essentially bringing this question whether or not overparameterization is the right regime if we want robustness. And there are a lot of interesting and open questions that we are essentially thinking about at this point in EnCORE. Thank you. Let me actually stop here.
Thank you. All right, let's go to our last panel member, Eric Toberer.
Hello. Cheers. Hello, hello.
Yeah, I think it's fine.
It's
I think
on?
it's fine.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, folks. I'm Eric Toberer, and we've been in about an hour of PowerPoint straight at this point, if my memory is roughly right. And so what I'm going to note is that more than anything, I want to get great questions from the audience. And so now would be a great time to go and get chocolate chip cookies that are literally hot and fresh over there. So I had one a little bit ago, would recommend. So feel free to stand up and ignore what I'm about to say. I won't be offended. Okay, so let's take this thing for a little bit of a spin. So I'm the director of this newish institute, the Data-Driven Dynamical Design, ID4 for short. We like our acronyms, as does literally everybody in this room, it seems like. Two of my co-conspirators are here, Jane right here and Stephen in the far back. And in short, this is a relatively ambiguous title. So what is this thing really all about? So what we are is, as an institute, right, we are much more in the, and I quote from earlier today, we are institute in data-intensive science and engineering, right? And rather than, say, for example, training the next generation, which of course we're still interested in, but I think we bring in a lot more domain expertise in terms of sort of the makeup of our institute, right? And this brings up sort of this sort of broad space of like responsible computing. I think this really means that we're bringing in users into the forum rather than like, sort of aggregating data from society, let's say, right? And so broadly speaking, sort of throughout this, we're interested in problems involving energy and sustainability. And in particular, we're interested in efficiently designing new materials and structures to basically begin the process of dealing with the energy catastrophe that is slowly unfolding before us, right? I've always been known for my positivity. So, right. And so a lot of this though is about collective dynamics of complex systems in like crazy high dimensions, right? Where if you put a vector on every one of these atoms and you say, okay, this is the behavior of this atom, and sure, maybe it's an indistinguishable atom if you're lucky, but like, what is it doing as a function of time, right? Like, and how do you create systems that actually get you to the functionality, some sort of objective function that you're looking for, right? So let's see if I can get this thing to work. Hey, it did. So on the right here, I list the 4 domain areas that ID4 is working on. And in particular, we're interested in things like ion transport for batteries and fuel cells and things like that. Stephen, for example, works on sort of very broadly excited quantum states, but really what that means in his particular case is photocatalysis. So like light comes in and chemistry happens. We have a whole bunch of work at the continuum scale here involving these sort of dynamical structures at the macroscopic scale. Like we literally have architects on the team, which is really fun. I've never worked with architects before. And last but not least, things like I alluded to over here on the left involving like chemical nucleation and sort of like stochastic processes, right? And right off the bat, you can see like, wow, okay, you're like spanning like dynamical, like literally building like skyscrapers under wind loads, all the way down to the atomic with respect to chemical nucleation. Okay, this is my last slide. I wanted to keep this short to like encourage us to actually get to questions and not just have this be, 3 talks in a row. Okay, what are we pretty good at, right? Like we're an institute, we got a bunch of years left. We have a lot of money to like establish partnerships with you all. We're gonna throw a bunch of workshops over the next couple of years. And so things that we're really good at, right, is we have problems. So for those of you who do not actually have problems, A, good for you. And B, we have lots of domain embedded problems that I think are really important for society. And we are always looking for external collaborators. So we're good at simulation, and like in particular, I'd like call out like auto differentiation and trying to sort of navigate high dimensional spaces in some sort of robust way, right? I'll let you read the strengths up here. These are not actually the part that I want to bring up. If we could pretend that black box wasn't there, underneath that it would say, what challenges do we actually need help on like today, right? Here's the long list. And in particular, one of the things that sort of I think is relevant for the sort of nominally the focus of this, right, is how do we build multiple layers of machine learning solutions for practicing domain scientists in a way that is robust and reproducible and doesn't lead to anything from like data leakage to all the other problems you can get with machine learning, right? And so I want to be able to ultimately say like, okay, here's a package, here's another package, and here's another package. One might be a generative model to help you sort of explore a space. One might involve some sort of auto diff to help you actually explore that space. And maybe there's something involving visualization and like dimensional reduction, and being able to like seamlessly bring those together in a way that the community actually uses is like, would be awesome if you could do it, but it's also sort of terrifying too, right? If you say like, dear random scientists, like, let's really change how your workflow is today, right? Right, so to me, that's a huge challenge. These are other things that, you know, if any of this like tickles you, like I'd love to talk to you one-on-one about that. All right, I'm gonna shut it down.
Thank you. All right, second. All right, so now I'd like to open the audience to questions. There any? Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question for two different panel members, but I'll start with the one. I think all of us will agree that the bane of a good deep learning algorithm is good data, good label data. And especially, you know, looking at examples from Imageomics, if you're looking at the minnow population and all the minor variations and some things that the human eye cannot even see, how do you go about getting good label data? Chasing folks who know the variations, but then there are variations they may not even know about.
Thank you for that question. Vandana, so that's, you know, we actually flip that thinking. We, you know, in all the conversations about bias, we try to counter bias in all the other data science, right? And all the other machine learning, where like, how do we get good ground truth? How do we get unbiased data, or how do we counter bias? So we're in Imageomics, we're dealing in a domain where human bias is so strong that there is no hope, right, at all for humans to unbias. So we're actually using machine learning to point out to things that humans may completely miss, not see, you know, biological traits that are completely not at all humanly seeable or evaluatable. So then the question is, how do we then verify it? And this is where I think we flip the thinking from the outcome of machine learning is something that can be verified by a human, to the outcome of machine learning is a scientific hypothesis that we should think of testing in the same way we would test any other scientific hypothesis, and think of it as an experimental, for example, verification. If the outcome of our machine learning is, so the slide that I actually skipped, is the heritability of zebra stripe patterns or leopard spot patterns. This is not something that humans can see. If I look at two pairs of zebras, you know, like the stripes more similar on this one versus this one, I have no idea. But if we design machine learning algorithms in a way that or computer vision point out and say, here's the part of the pattern that's conserved from mother and father to child, and there's a correlation between genetic relatedness, let's say, and the pattern, this is something we can verify experimentally, even if humans cannot see it, right? And so flipping the way we formulate the problem and flipping how we think about the outcome of machine learning and data science methodology in a way where maybe it's not necessary for human to see, but we can connect it to genomic data, to, you know, other ways to verify it.
I would also note, like, coming from the ID4 perspective, where we're dealing with domain scientists and we actually have like testable hypotheses, I totally agree with you. One thing that's really lovely, right, is like a quarter of our team is built out of experimentalists, right? So like we have at least 4 faculty on there who are like regular, I think 5 actually, 5 faculty who are regularly going into the lab and saying like, okay, machine learning like suggested this, right? Like Stephen makes suggestions, and like we go and test that. And along the way, we may not understand like all the sort of steps about how things were labeled and categorized and so on and so forth. But in the end, like the thing is like practicing, you know, chemists and engineers and whatnot, that we care about is it's like, does it work, right?
I just want to add one quick thing. We're very comfortable with this kind of approach in genomics, right? The fact that humans cannot see stuff in the genome, but we have experiments to verify the suggestion, the correlations that come out of genome-wide association studies, right, GWAS. So I think we just kind of have to generalize some of this thinking that already exists in some domains.
Any other comments from the panel members? All right, let's go to our next question. Yeah.
Oh, my name is Hugh Liang, UTC. I have two questions. The first one is HGNN. It's a hierarchical guided neural network. My question is that your contribution, I have not read the paper yet. My question is that your contribution is focused on another novel neural network architecture or just the neural, like the data formulations?
Thank you for that one. So this is, yeah, so the hierarchical guided neural network guided by phylogeny. So this is a more of a proof of concept paper that shows that by adding biological structures, you not only improve accuracy, particularly in the low data regime, but you improve the explainability or at least some interpretability of the outcome. We hope that, you know, that, and this came out of BGNN, the Biologically Guided Neural Networks Ideas funded project that was the foundation, one of the two halves of Imageomics foundations. The hope is that as we progress, among the several outcomes that we explicitly promise in Imageomics is the frameworks, the generalizable frameworks of incorporating structured knowledge in machine learning architecture, model architecture design, and methodology for evaluating together with all the test data sets and other sort of necessary things for benchmarking these kinds of approaches. But the thinking of how do you systematically incorporate structured knowledge, not only in terms of hierarchies, we start with hierarchies, they're easy, but in terms of ontologies that are much richer kind of relational data. And how do you extract those directly from unstructured knowledge? That's one of the big outcomes that we hope will come out within, watch this space in the next year or so.
Thanks. I have another question, I'm sorry.
Oh, I have a follow-up question.
Yeah, for the online panel. Is the over parametric is the problem? Is like the over something related with overfitting or something, another new concept?
Well, overparameterization leads to, I mean, it doesn't actually lead to overfitting, it leads to interpolation. But these are different concepts.
Different concept, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah.
I have a follow-up question to the previous question, which was maybe for Hamed and Adam, which is that there's a lot of, especially in various scientific domains, there's a lot of interest now in embedding symmetries into your networks or enforcing hierarchies or doing, putting explicit constraints in the network. The problem, or there's a huge advantage, right, is that sometimes it makes it much easier to train, right? You kind of reduce the number of parameters in your network, but there's a disadvantage is that data is not necessarily reflective of these symmetries, right? It's not, symmetries are often not perfect in nature. And I was wondering if there's like kind of if there are ideas for how to balance, the imperfectness of the data with the kind of perfectness of kind of the theories that we're trying to embed.
Do you want to take that first?
Actually, a great question. I don't know. Very good question.
Maybe it's a question for the audience.
Yeah.
Raise your hand if you know the answer.
The longer you've been in academia, the more willing you are to address questions you know nothing about. So I'll take bash at this. No. So I think, basically it's something that as a community we're trying to figure out, but there are lots of contexts. I don't, the broad term is sort of meta learning, where I've got a collection of tasks of learning problems that I'm trying to solve all at the same time and exploit the shared structure. And I think there are broadly, people trying to kind of program in the shared structure or trying to learn it. And just like everything else, the trade-off is you need a lot more data to learn the shared structure. You need more different tasks, and they have to be representative. And so I guess the promise of trying to intelligently use stuff we know, like the phylogeny, is that indeed it sort of gets us much closer to the right starting point. And there's no reason to think that's not a generally good approach, right? I guess you just have to be careful not to, land in the circular reasoning trap of discovering the conclusions you hardwired into your network or your structure, right?
There's light when the sun comes up. That's my favorite example. But there was I think there was a
You have a follow-up?
potential answer.
So, hi, my name is Jeremiah Sulam. I'm from Johns Hopkins. I really loved your question about how to, how can you get by learning from data, which doesn't quite respect symmetries, but you want to nonetheless enforce these because you know that they're helpful. They're helpful from an optimization point of view. They're helpful from a statistical learning point of view. And I'm not an expert on this at all. And so if there's an expert in the room, I would very happily defer to them. But I do know of some very interesting work coming from Los Alamos by a name that I'm blanking on right now, but I'll be happy to pass along later. But basically their approach is, let's say that you want to learn corrections to your equations driving physical models, and you know that these equations are incorrect by a little bit, and you want to learn these corrections. Now, there are certain ways in which these laws are incorrect that are more obvious than others, and you do know that some symmetries are certainly enforced. For example, conservation of energy. You can sort of rest you can be at rest that this is preserved, and so you can embed that part of the symmetry into your problem and not perhaps all of them. So I guess it's a matter of taking priority in which symmetries you want to preserve.
That's a beautiful example, actually, of physics-guided machine learning approach, and they're the ones who are pioneering that.
Yeah. So one comment on that is that is the notion that deep learning models are kind of the quote unquote universal function approximator, and they require no feature engineering. So the more structure you impose on the modeling itself, you're kind of going away from the original notion of deep learning that requires no feature engineering, unlike other machine learning models that are very heavy on that.
All right. Yeah, a few more questions.
Yes, my name is Naoki Saito from UC Davis, and I would like to ask you, panelists, the question about we tend the following. So we tend to analyze existing data or easily measurable data, especially if there are abundant of those images and sound and so forth. But I just would like to emphasize importance of developing new type of sensors which can measure decisive information. So if one can do that, then some of the basically machine learning tasks will not be basically necessary anymore. And I have some experience, and so I'm curious how we can, as a community, can feed back, or giving some comments to people who are developing sensors or new type of sensors, and in particular that the classification of a butterfly and so forth. Obviously, this visual information is most common and easy, to get. But I'm curious whether there's any other type of measurement one can ideally do, so that instead of relying on the visual information, one can whether you can classify easily by not fooled by the visual appearance, for example.
Yeah, thank you. I'll start, and maybe actually, I'm sure in material science, in material design, there's the same kind of question from a different, but biology is one of the most obvious, right? We've been observing the world through eyes visually for millennia, in fact, and technology over the years has helped us increasingly see things that we cannot see with our eyes directly. You know, microscope and then electronic microscope helped us go down to very, very fine scale. And then the telescopes and binoculars and now satellite let us scale up to the planetary scales. And I actually don't think that, and it hasn't stopped, right? So right now, as new technology is being developed, whether it's on-body sensors that put our on-body of animals, or the acoustic sensors, or camera traps, or anything else, it's just more ability to see. So essentially, and observe the natural world. Genomics is I think a qualitatively different example there. That's no hope of seeing, and we're not actually looking there. And so that hasn't stopped the need for processing all that data. And I think the more collaborative the conversations about the technology development, the data analysis, to quote Poincaré, I love the quote that, this book on data and method, science and method that he wrote in 19th century, where we today uses the foundation of scientific method, essentially. It's a very thin book, beautiful. He writes, under Poincaré, at the end of this, writes, so if the scientist had at his disposal the ability to look at the infinity of things and with the infinity of time, then we'll just look at everything. But since there is no ability to look at everything, and especially to look carefully, and it's better not to look at all than to look carelessly, something I tell my students, then the first thing is then that the task the scientist faces is choosing what to look at. And so all I would argue is all of the technological developments, including computational, the only thing that they change in science is the ability to look at more things more carefully. And the technology itself is to look at more things, but the machine learning data analysis is the ability to look more carefully.
I mean, just to build on that, like we put nothing that we do is cheap, right? Be it experimental or computational, right? Like we're asking hard problems that have a time domain component, right? Things are evolving. And so for us, it's exactly that, right? It's about resource optimization, right? So like, if you put out more sensors, what did you lose as a cost of putting out more sensors, right? Not just in terms of like analyzing it, but like literally budget, right? So for us, it's often, how many graduate student hours is this going to take? Or, what is the, wall time on a supercomputer, right? And so for us, we put a fair bit of work into making like non-myopic decisions about where to put our resources in a automated or semi-automated way.
I have a question for Adam.
Well, we have a question here from, yeah.
Maybe, so my question is, a lot of domains of science have built up over decades or centuries, kind of their own languages, and in many cases of engineering, they use differential equations or they use linear systems and electrical engineering, and so they've built up this library of knowledge and experience through courses, and it seems to me that in many ways, kind of the deep learning framework is very much suited towards problems for which we don't have very good models of how this data was generated. Like how do you build a differential equation model for how an image gets collected into a picture and things like that. And so deep learning is a very good solution to that problem. So how do you marry all of this prior information that we've collected in science and that we have beautiful mathematical descriptions of with these non-parametric function estimators and kind of make them all work together?
Knowledge guided machine learning. I mean, no, I'm not joking. This is a whole field. There is a workshop. There's a paper in 2017, which is kind of the statement paper in a survey. There is now thousands and thousands of papers in the domain of knowledge guided machine learning. It started actually with physics guided machine learning, which took the physics equations and sort of use them to constrain the structure of machine learning. And we're building on this with the biological structures, but there's like that really literally is the field that looks at how do we incorporate this built up knowledge and theories into the structure of machine learning, particularly both to get away, both to deal with the imperfect data regimes and to drive towards explainability and interpretability.
Did you want to comment? Yeah.
Briefly, not just to point out that I think a lot of the early advances in machine learning were driven by in the deep learning space. Early meaning 10 years ago. Were driven by image and natural language data because for sort of artificial reasons of what data is available, what's cool, what Google needs to solve. And so I think this broadening is really like pushing us as a community to think of like a much richer set of models of exactly the kind that Tanya was saying. I think that's a great thing, and hopefully it will kind of will shift our view of what are the basic ideas in deep learning as a result.
I'd just like to jump in on that too. We should probably get a coffee and talk about this because there's so much richness there, but I would maybe question the original assumption, if I understood it correctly in the question, which is even Newtonian mechanics, F equals ma, right? There's so much, if you push that out deep into the time domain in a complicated system, like sure, we can write down the equation, but like coming at it from a design point of view is still immensely hard in terms of navigating a high dimensional space and finding all the basins of attraction and actually being able to talk about how something complicated will evolve. So I don't think there's any easy questions out there.
One last question.
Yes, actually, it was related to the comment you made. I want to say that putting these hard constraints using differential equation and mechanistic models, I think that's one way of doing that. Being a Bayesian, within the Bayesian framework, you can put a softer constraint in form of priors that they can be overwhelmed by data if data disagrees with your domain knowledge. So that was a comment that I wanted to make. Related to the question at the beginning, I wanted to say that there are in biomedical sciences that they try to adjust your data with census data. So weighting them. And I think that's the responsible way to go. And I don't know if there are examples of that in any other areas.
Just want to comment?
Do you want? I think this is a question about privacy and differential privacy and generating distributions.
Well, not me. I'm not sure. I mean, the way census data gets used in a lot of social science settings is one of the things people use it for is to reweight and adjust. Yeah. I mean, independent of privacy or anything like that, it's just used to try and
not privacy, but sample selection.
Yeah, to add to come up with sample weights so that the data, you run some survey, you get some people who answer, and then you reweight it so that that survey looks more representative of a specific population. I'm sure that happens in many parts of science. It's maybe something that is, for example, in this kind of space of fair machine learning, where people are concerned with, sensitivity to like gender and race, things like that. There is a lot of reweighting that's done. The only thing I'd say is we're moving towards like way more sophisticated ways of doing this than just reweighting. And there's been like a lot of advances in sort of what kind of the meaning of calibration is. So I think, yes, this happens not just with census data, and yes, it's like there are actually interesting unsolved like science questions there, methodology questions and stuff.
I mean, long before it was happening with census data, I think, or at least at the same amount of length, the biologists have been doing it for population studies and for species studies and for, adjusting occupancy models and rare species corrections and the observational bias and all of these other things. We're now doing it in a lot more sophisticated ways than we've been doing it before, and starting to come up with a lot more sophisticated ways. But there's a caution thing there that if you over adjust these models for the previous census, current census, the current distributions, you're starting to lose out on rare events and tiny subpopulations, data subsets and subpopulations And there are plenty of examples of that for rare disease, everything from rare diseases to opinions to rare species and all the other things.
All right, why don't we thank the panel speakers again?